I wanted to just actually start by, since Darius and Leonard have done such a nice job of giving background and have been in the field so long, I'm actually a relative newcomer to this. And I come to it as a skeptic. In fact, the first inclination I had or the first introduction I had to the whole issue of RF, EMF, and diseases was a meeting I had with Deborah Davis when she was on a tour for her book, The Secret War of Cancer. My book on drinking water just come out. My background was more in drinking water and in air pollution, and not in radio frequencies. And I put this up not just as a shameless plug for my book, but actually because I'm going to come back to that as because it informed the way I look at this. And a few years after that meeting, Deborah's book came out, and I remained a skeptic. When I met Deborah, I said, well, look, this is microwaves. All it does is heat tissue. And she kind of nodded and said, yeah, I think there's more to it. And I said, well, and why aren't we seeing, an epidemic of brain cancer? And he said, well, we'll talk about that. And so I continued to work on what I was working on. And then in 2011, the IARC study came out, and I have the highest respect for IARC. And I started to take this seriously, but the fact is, what IARC said specifically was there's really some provocative evidence in the epidemiology, but we really don't have the laboratory studies to back this up, so we're going to say this is a possible carcinogen. Now, epidemiologists are basically in the business of criticizing other epidemiologists. And so it's always possible to criticize epidemiological studies because they are by nature flawed. That is, you can't, if we really wanted to study this question, we'd get a few thousand kids and we'd put them in cages and we'd give them cell phones to half of them randomly, and then we'd follow them for 30 or 40 years and see who gets cancer. But that's just generally not done. We have to observe people, and there's two problems here. I thought the woman that had the question earlier about cohort studies, one of the big problems is if you want to study a cancer that takes decades to appear, it's very hard to do a cohort study. That is a study where you can look at who's exposed and then follow them over time. You're left primarily, almost the only study you can do is a case control study, such as Leonard has done. And so it was really a question of where is some corroborating evidence to back up the epidemiology, because you can always find a way to criticize the epidemiology. And we didn't really understand the mechanism. Okay. This is where I'm going to go back to drinking water for a little bit, because it actually informed the way I was looking at this problem. Because I thought back, I had studied and written a lot about the history of public health, and particularly the history of drinking water. This is somebody with cholera, and it was called the Blue Death because you would basically get asphyxiated because you got dehydrated and your blood was so thick you couldn't pump it anymore. All right. And back in the 19th century, when Europe was overrun by cholera in a series of devastating epidemics, nobody understood why it was what was causing it. The prevailing theory was it was something in the air. And every medical student and public health student and epidemiologist is taught that John Snow came along and he essentially invented epidemiology just to show that the drinking water was causing disease. And famously took the handle off the Broad Street pump and stopped a local outbreak. And that's sort of where the story ends in public health school. But the fact is, if you look at it carefully, nobody believed this guy. I mean, we think it's obvious, and we look at the epidemiology and says, yeah, I mean, of course this makes sense. But at the time, nobody really took him all that seriously. And people knew that there was stuff in the drinking water, and there were even books where they take a microscope and look at what's in the water. But here's the thing, and here's where I come back to microwaves. Nobody could believe that something that you could hide in a glass of water, you couldn't see it, you couldn't smell it, you couldn't taste it. It was so small you needed a microscope just to see it. Nobody could believe that that could make you sick, that that could kill you in a matter of a day or two. It just didn't seem possible. So here was the same story. This story where we don't know the mechanism, but we find an association, is as old as public health itself. Okay? And so the fact that we didn't really have clear evidence as to what was the mechanism behind this relationship with radio frequency radiation, I was looking at it in a new light as I thought back to what I knew about water. I mean, in fact, if you go back to the time of cholera, where the sewers were only used to drain the streets, everybody, the wastewater from the home was in a cesspool under the houses all over London, and the rest of the waste was in privies all over London. It must have been a god-awful place to spend time. And so actually the powers of the day, the ICNIRP of the time, would have been somebody like Edwin Chadwick, the sanitarians, who believed all you had to do was get that stink out of where people were living and you were going to solve the problem. And the establishment of medicine was all behind him. John Snow had come up from a working father. He had not gone to the right schools. Thank you. And he had, everybody else in medicine in London had gone to Cambridge or Oxford and gone to the right schools, and they were all great men of science, except for the fact that they were all wrong. Let's see. I don't know why those are supposed to be not showing up. Okay. And in fact, the real thing that changed, just to finish this story, the real thing that changed what happened in London was not so much the fact, and in fact, what Chadwick did was he said, let's hook the cesspools up to the sewers so we can get the stink out of the towns. Everything got washed into the Thames, and which was great. It got rid of some of the smells, except for one small thing, which is that London was drinking out of the Thames. So in the next wave of cholera epidemics, it was the worst of all, because they had essentially, in trying to solve the problem, made it dramatically worse. But what changed policy, in fact, was a dry summer in which the Thames became essentially a sloshing cesspool, and Parliament being right on the Thames, the members of Parliament acted very quickly to get the sewage out of town, and they built one of the biggest public works projects in the history of England at the time, which was 11-mile pipes to put everything downstream, which was fantastic unless you lived 12 miles downstream. All right. And it wasn't really until, oops, all right, we'll skip that. It wasn't really until Koch and Pasteur, or Koch himself, tracked down the cause as a bacteria. All right, so for me, the discovery of the cholera bacteria in this case was the NTP studies, because the NTP studies, and I didn't realize that all of the NTP reporting was going to come to me, so I don't have all of the results here, but I have what was very striking to me about the NTP studies, and that was the fact that in all of these studies, they were finding exactly the same kinds of tumors that were showing up in the epidemiology studies. That, if you're an epidemiologist or an environmental health scientist, that is extremely compelling. Because if they were showing up with colon cancer in mice and brain cancer in humans, well, then you might say, well, maybe the colon cancer in the mice is just a chance finding, or maybe there's some confusion here. The chances that these studies would find exactly the same tumors as the epidemiology are pretty much nil. It just wasn't going to happen. And there have been some criticisms of the NTP studies, but to me it was a very powerful finding, and I was, I can spend more time on this study, but I think to me that was the important thing. And I'm going to skip to what struck me, which was the media reaction to this study. I was really stunned when I saw these headlines or this was the headlines for the reporting on this. And essentially the top newspapers in the country were reporting that this was a non-issue. I mean, and that this was much ado about nothing. This was just a rat study. This was just one study. This was a small study. And oddly, many of these arguments were repeated in many of these papers, and which was crazy. This was a $25 million study. It was one of the most elaborate and expensive studies conducted by the NTP of any kind, and by very heavily vetted by a lot of scientists, and the results were so powerful that they released the results early. So I thought, why? And if you look at who was doing this, I mean, Bloomberg had a sex reporter writing this one, a sex columnist. The New York Times had a physician, but he was basically a health economist writing about it. The Washington Post had a recent intern writing about it. These were not people who were coming up with these criticisms on their own. All right. So how is this happening? Well, we're all familiar with what the cigarette industry was able to do in terms of findings about cigarettes and cancer, and how for decades after the early epidemiology came out, they were able to refute the notion that cigarettes were causing cancer. And the reason for that is, they're making $150 billion a year, and so that money is able to get rid of a lot of science, and they were very successful in dismissing the science for decades, partly because they said, well, we don't know exactly how cigarettes are causing cancer. Now, the cell phone industry makes this look puny, okay? They have 10 times the income of the cigarette industry, and it's actually they're dealing with a risk that's harder to prove, much easier to dismiss, and so we're going to, this battle is going to go on for a very long time. They don't even have to work very hard to try to make this go away. I'm absolutely certain that they were feeding information to these papers or to these reporters, and it's very hard for the scientists to be heard above that. They don't have a PR machine. They don't have that same, the connections in the media to make this go away. So this is a tough challenge. Let me give you some specific examples. This is a warning in the CDC website about cell phones and cancer. This was the way it was originally written. Along with many organizations worldwide, we, the CDC, recommend caution in cell phone use. The cell phone industry didn't like this, okay? And so they managed, and I don't know how it happened, I don't know the politics of this, but they managed to get a guy named Ken Foster hired by the CDC to rewrite what was on these websites. Ken Foster is a longtime consultant of the cell phone industry. I'm sort of dumbfounded about how this happened. Somebody probably knows, but I don't. But I can show you what happened. Suddenly this changed to some organizations recommend caution, no longer the CDC. The statement, do cell phones cause health problems in children? Children who use cell phones continue to use them as they get older are likely to be around RF for many years. If RF causes health problems, kids who use them might have a higher chance of developing these problems in the future. I mean, not a very strong statement, but that was too strong for Ken Foster, who changed it to say, all he says now is we do know that children who start using cell phones will be exposed to radio frequency for longer. I mean, that's a tautology. That's nothing. It's like, okay. But even that had to go away. Now, then it became, do cell phones cause problems? It's not known if cell phones used by children can cause health problems. And then, as of 2015, it all just went away. Okay? And so that's kind of what we're dealing with. Here, I had some direct experience. This was a paper that was published in the IEEE journal, which is, for electrical and electronics engineers by Ken Foster and Chung-Wing Chu. And what they did is they looked at papers that had compared exposure from cell phones in adults and children to see who absorbed a higher dose of cell phone radiation. And there had been about 23 studies, and they looked at them all. They calculated the ratio of the peak absorption in children and adults and compared them. And they concluded, quote, simple generalizations found on the internet about absorbing more RF energy than adults from cell phones, about kids absorbing more RF energy than adults from cell phones, aren't supported by available dosimetry studies. All right? But then we look more closely at this. This is their summary of the results from the studies. Nobody's going to read this, okay? They're going to look at this figure. And this figure, I'll blow it up so you can see it a little better. But what they did is they calculated a ratio of the absorbed radiation in adults divided by in kids over the absorbed radiation in adults. So if those bars go above the line, it means the kids are absorbing more. If they go below the line, it means adults are absorbing more. Let's continue to look at this more closely. So if we look at one of those, okay, this is small volumes of the brain exposed to high frequency, high band radiation. That's the frequency used in most cell phones. And if you look at this, is this a pointer? Okay, if you look at these, most of these lines go down, okay? If the line goes below 1, that means supposedly adults are absorbing more radiation than kids. So there's only one bar that goes up. This, if you just looked at these figures quickly, you'd say, oh yeah, the data support what these guys are saying. Adults, if anything, are absorbing more than children. Now let's compare what's in this figure to what's buried in the text of that table. These are quotes from the actual studies as taken by the people by Foster and Chu. So here whoa, let's see. Careful what button you press. So both of these bars go down, suggesting adults have higher exposure. But if you look at what it says, the quote from the paper says, because of deeper penetration in smaller models, children have considerably higher internal tissue SARS, that's the absorbed radiation, than adults. That's kind of odd. Look at this one. For the brain of the child model, the peak may be 50 to 50% higher compared to the SARS in adults. Or this one. The line is going down, suggesting higher exposure in adults, but this or higher doses in adults. But this says the max SAR is slightly more significant than the one for adults. Or this one, max is between is about 2 times higher. The children's dose is 2 times higher than the adults. And this bar suggests it's 2 times higher in adults than children. This says there were no systematic differences. So essentially, what's in their figure doesn't agree with the quotes that they took out of the tables. So we wrote this up, and we published it in the same journal. And they came back and said, oh, well, we really meant that the dose to the entire head is larger than in adults than children. Now, it just means that adults have a bigger head, so when you put a cell phone up next to it, less of it, goes off as stray radiation. But it has nothing to do with the peak dose to the kids. It's biologically completely irrelevant. But if you say that to engineers, their interpretation of it is obviously going to be, yeah, all these studies saying kids are higher risk are bunk. And it was completely disingenuous. If you compare, so this is just a comparison of the, a little cautious. This is just a comparison. So in the data from the figures, it looks like most of the studies show higher exposure in adults, whereas if you look at the table, most of the studies are showing higher doses in children. Now I want to come back to this whole issue of trends one more time, because this is one of the other main arguments against the possibility that cell phones are increasing cancer risk. This is from a study by the National Cancer Institute where they looked at cancer trends, which are this squiggly line down here. Those are the actual cancer data. And this is what they say should be happening if the epidemiology studies are in fact correct. But the problem is this whole issue of lag time. These are data from cancer, from smoking. Here's smoking rates in the United States, which started to rise in the early part of the 20th century. The cancer rates, the lung cancer rates, didn't start to take off until about 30 years later. Okay? So if you looked here at lung cancer rates and compared and said, well, why, look, we've had this big rise in smoking rates. Why don't we have a rise in lung cancer rates? It was because there's a disease latency. You don't smoke a cigarette today and get cancer tomorrow. You get it 30 years later. And the same thing likely holds in the case of radiofrequency and brain cancer. And in fact, if you look at brain cancer in Hiroshima, where you have ionizing radiation exposure, in Hiroshima, there's almost a 40-year lag between when the bomb was dropped and when you see a rise in brain cancer rates. These cancers take a long time to develop. I mean, this is a very crude analysis I did where I just took, this is the rise in the number of mobile phones in the United States up until 2000. And if there was in fact a 15-year lag, for example, we wouldn't really start to see much of a rise in brain cancer rates until sometime after 2010. The NCI study cuts off at 2008. So there's no reason really to expect a huge rise in brain cancer rates in the United States quite yet, especially if you lump them all together. If you start to separate them out the way Leonard did, then you might see something differently. And in fact, if you had a 30-year lag that showed up in Hiroshima with brain cancer, you might not start to see a big rise until much farther out here. So what this means is we're conducting a massive experiment. Okay? We've handed phones out to everybody, and we're just going to wait and see what happens, because in a way, that's the only thing that's going to convince everybody is if those trends start to go up. If those trends start to go up, we're screwed, because that's just the beginning. They're just beginning to go up, and we're going to see the rise. And so if, in fact, there's a risk, we're all part of probably the largest uncontrolled experiment in human history. So what do we do about this? Lots of countries have actually taken steps to control access to both cell phones and Wi-Fi technology. All of these countries have either laws regulating wireless technologies or recommendations from their health commissions suggesting measures that one could take to reduce risk. France has really been a leader in this, and in fact have now banned Wi-Fi from all nursery schools. They have regulations that routers need to be turned off when they're not in use. Ads for cell phones need to recommend headsets. Wi-Fi hotspots need to be labeled. Maps of cell antennas. You don't have to walk around with a device like like we just saw. They also already had laws in place as of 2011 as to the regulation of cell phone sales, who could buy them, and whom they could be marketed to. Belgium has laws specifically focused on cell phones, banning mobile phones for children under 7, banning mobile phones advertising for children under 7. Taiwan bans on children from under 2 using electronic devices, and the parents are going to get fined pretty heavily if they don't follow that rule. There are rules in place. If you want to see a list of all of these regulations, you can look at the Environmental Health Trust's website, and there's also more information about the NTP study and a list of all of the arguments that were posted in those papers. All right, so what do we do? Well, I think you can break this. First of all, you can kind of break the devices into whether they're accessing the wireless mobile phone system or whether they're using Wi-Fi. And if we look first at mobile phones, and you look at the radiation penetrating this poor girl's head, why is that not fancy? All right. In fact, children do absorb substantially more radiation than adults. They have higher peak doses, and those doses reach farther into the head. These are very recent models done by, with Environmental Health Trust funded some research with some really excellent Brazilian team that's modeling these. And so the kids are going to get higher exposure, higher peak doses to the brain. And even if you use these devices, this is a modeling they did using them as virtual reality devices, and you get a completely different set of exposures, but again, it's penetrating far more deeply into the brain of a child than an adult. As I said, there have been a lot of ways to regulate cell phones, but none of these is really focused on cell phones in schools. So the question is, should we have cell phones in schools? First of all, I haven't seen a good educational reason to have cell phones in schools. I'm willing to listen to one, but I haven't seen one. Clearly, they're disruptive. I think kids need a little time away from this experiment we're conducting on them, both for reasons of physical health and for reasons of mental health. So my feeling is, this is heroin. We're giving it to our kids. I think we could all stand to have these removed from schools. I think I would advocate very strongly that there be no cell phones in schools. And we all know the consequences if the wrong people get a hold of a cell phone. The towers themselves are less of an issue. They certainly shouldn't be anywhere near a school, much less on a school, as I've seen pictures of them being placed on schools. So let's look at Wi-Fi and think of it in terms of the precautionary principle. As Darius pointed out, the exposures are much lower, and our level of information is also much lower when it comes to Wi-Fi. So I think this is sort of a perfect example of where you could invoke a precautionary principle. The question is, where do you draw the lines? I mean, do you just say, we're going to be exercising precaution by getting it completely out of the schools, or are we going to try to get as low as we possibly can, and hopefully you can remove it from schools, but often, that's economically, that may be tough to do. Certainly there is a place at higher grades for, oops. So I suggest that we approach this by using this ALARA concept as low as reasonably achievable for the level of Wi-Fi that we allow in schools. I think you got to protect very young children. I don't think there's any place for Wi-Fi in the younger age groups. And look for low or no-cost ways to minimize exposure. Now, it's not really the router, as again was pointed out earlier. It's not really the router that's causing exposure. It's the devices that a Wi-Fi router allows into the school. So it's really the Wi-Fi connected tablet that some kid is putting in his lap that is going to be much more important as a source of exposure than the actual router itself. But there are things you can do with routers. You can switch them off when they're not needed. You can make sure nobody's sitting right next to a router, and you can keep them out of schools with young children. The devices, again, you have some of the same issues. You have a weaker signal, and you have a different frequency from what's being used in cell phones. We don't really know exactly what the issues might be. I think I've got to keep my hands. Okay. I mean, a laptop, this is, again, modeling from this same group in Brazil, Claudio Fernandez and his colleagues, and this is the exposure you get if you put a laptop in your lap. There's really one truism about a laptop is that it does not belong in your lap. The other is I've never seen a teenager sit like this, and they're apt to be back like this with a thing on their belly, and so they're maximally radiating their gonads with the antenna. So basically, this is a laptop does not belong in a lap, and ideally it's not connected. So in terms of tablets and laptops in schools, I don't think there's any reason for them ever to be connected to the telephone network, because that, again, is going to have the same powerful signals that you have coming out of phones. I don't think very young children should be using them. I think if you're going to connect these devices to the internet, you've got to have a good educational justification for it that outweighs the potential risk you might be introducing, and the devices should be kept on a table so their distance is really your friend, and it's astonishing how quickly the dose drops off even with a slight increase in distance. So to summarize, I think we need to get cell phones out of schools, period. I think we need to apply principles for the use of Wi-Fi that minimize our exposure. That means using wired networks or alternative networks whenever possible. If you're going to use a Wi-Fi router, you've got to turn it off when it's not in use. The devices should be as far from the kids' brains and testicles as possible. And we need to really think about, are we just putting this stuff in here because it's cool or because it can do something new, or is there actually a really strong educational justification for doing it? And finally, cell phone antennae shouldn't be on or near schools. Let's see, did I get signal? Oh, I have time. Well, then I have time for questions because I'm actually finished. Thanks very much. Any questions? Oh, the website. Yeah, sure. I mean, if you go, it's, let's see, where is it? There we go. Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, if you just go to ehtrust.org, you can, it's pretty easy to find your way to that information. There's a whole section on policy, and there's also a long section on the NTP study, and our responses to some of the criticisms that have been raised about the NTP study. Yeah. On the school.
And they use mobile phones and wireless network in the school.
Mm-hmm.
Is it on? Yeah. So what would be your advice on how to start engaging my local council in trying to get rid of those hazards, potential hazards in the school?
So are the mobile phones in the schools are they using them educationally, or is it just, they're just allowing them? Okay.
In a lesson, but they do allow the mobile phones to be on in the lesson and on the with the child all day.
Okay, well, let's separate it in, the mobile phone issue and the Wi-Fi issue, because I think it's easier to make the case on mobile phones. How you approach your own school board, perhaps we can work with Sven to put together some materials you might be able to bring to your local school board to say that there's a risk related to cell phones. And I think we're also going to hear more about the psychological risks of access to cell phones. I kind of feel it's time for us to be the adults in the room, because we let our kids use cell phones partly because it's so damn hard to get them out of their fingers, And in a way, I think you could enlist a lot of parent support for the notion that they don't need to be with their cell phones 24/7. Most of us in this room actually, believe it or not, survived school without a cell phone, and we didn't die in school. Our parents were able to reach us in an emergency. It just wasn't necessary to have them in the classroom. And so, if they're going to keep them in their backpack, why are they in the room?
Exactly.
And so I think then you have to, so what's the system? Do they have to, keep them in their lockers? Do they park them somewhere? I can kind of understand that at the end of the day, you're trying to pick somebody up. Maybe you need to reach your child, but so you can kind of justify it. You need to provide them with some functional system that might be specific to a given school as to how, where to park the phones, when to park the phones, but they just don't need to come into a classroom. And, I get a text from one of my kids, and I know they're in class, and I'm thinking, I don't know if I want to get this text. So as far as the antenna, I think, you'd have to really look at the local politics and understand how it got there in the first place, how they justified it. And again, that might be something where we could provide you with some justification for getting that off the school.
I would love that.
Do you have a question?
With these antennas on schools, it is a tricky question, and there are some trade-offs. If you end up with school where kids are not using cell phone, it is not allowed, then take the cell tower wherever you like, no problem. But
Would you put it on the school? I mean,
yes, I would, because amount of radiation that is emitted by cell tower is minuscule compared with what is emitted by cell phone.
right.
If I have a kids in school and antenna is very close on school grounds, their cell phones emit much less radiation. But when this antenna is somewhere far away because I want them to be safe and have no antenna on school, then we are zapping them when they are using cell phone and much, much more. So in situation when we don't exactly know whether this level of radiation that is emitted continuously by cell tower is sufficient to cause some health problem. And at the same time, we know that cell phone radiation is possible carcinogen or maybe even probable. Then here is trade-off. Do I want to limit exposure to cell tower which has very little radiation at all, and at the same time zap my kids with their cell phones because cell tower is far?
Right. My only thought is if that antenna is really sitting right on top, is actually on the school, and you got a classroom right next door, you start to be close enough that the signal from the tower is a significant exposure. I think you're absolutely right that in most cases you're going to get much more exposure from something you hold to your head than from something that's 30 feet away, 10 meters away, or 20 meters away.
May I make a comment? I think the cell base stations should not be on schools because according to our, is this on? Our measurements, there may be these hotspots. We have measured like in Stockholm, the old town, and it's really high exposure in certain places where they have base stations very close to where people are sitting, and also the Stockholm Central Station with many hotspots. People are sitting very long periods there, or what we measured here yesterday, that's the Thermo showed previously. So I think the problem is for those persons who are not using the cell phone, should they suffer because of the cell phone users should have a good connection, because they will be exposed all the time. I mean, this is involuntary exposure to these kids and to the teachers, etc. And it is a continuous exposure. And I think that if you place it on the school, that will be okay. But then we need to measure the area and make a picture like Thermo showed. Where are the hotspots and how does it look like? And if we have hotspots, it should definitely be avoided. I think one problem is overall that we don't know the exposures. They should be measured much more. We are doing presently a school study about the measurements, and we can see that there is, exactly as said, a rather large variation in the exposure from the routers, and the routers are usually quite low as compared if the students use the mobile phone. This is, as you said, the high exposure, but then the routers which are not turned off, they will give a continuous exposure to the whole school. And the problem is also if you want to turn off them, that many of the routers are placed in the corridors and they are used in different classrooms. When should you disconnect them or not? You should then need to have a school where they say, well, this router, we say it's okay to use it, but it can only be used between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon or something like that. Other times it's disconnected. I don't know, but we need to have a much more progressive discussion, and we need to know about these exposures. And I think you had a very interesting picture about the virtual reality glasses, because they are coming now in Sweden, and even a newspaper, one of the leading, says that you should read the the newspaper with the virtual reality glass, and we are giving them free of charge for the first 100 persons who come to our exhibition. And otherwise you can buy them for a very cheap cost. And nobody talks about exposure, that even there is an exposure to radio frequencies from these glasses, or taking the goggle glass, which I know some doctors now use in the United States, for example, and they are exposed to. So there are many problems which are not discussed at all here. So it's a huge expansion of this technology that we need to know more about and know about the real exposure and compare that to the health effects. And I think, just as you said, that the precautionary principles should prevail.
Yeah, I mean, the French law tries to get at some of what you're talking about by saying we need to have maps of where these towers are and some measurements of the levels of radiation that's. I mean, the notion that you would put it on a school with no idea how much radiation is in an adjacent classroom is kind of crazy. Nobody's going out and measuring. All they care about is do people have good cell phone settings? That's what
I actually have a few questions on this, but we are pressed for time a little bit. But I know that, for example, one of the questions, but I think we'll take it to the panel at the end of the day, is that we are talking about exposure and mainly talking about glioma in the head, there's brain tumors, and exposure from cell phones and comparing with Wi-Fi and so on. What I'm interested in is, have you any research on the case that stronger radiation is worse or better than less radiation, the power of radiation? So that's something that has been, in my mind. We haven't seen, in my browsing, I haven't seen any confirmed, confirmation of that the stronger radiation is maybe worse. But the research has been focusing on the brain cancer from the cell phones, and everyone is always talking about this strong radiation. But I know that Leonard Hartle has done some research on the mobile phone masts. Towers, and maybe we can come back to that in the panel later today. But maybe my question is, do you know of any research that shows that more radiation is worse or better than less radiation? Yeah, in regards of a router or a mast, a tower, or a cell phone exposure. Then not just for carcinogen, but also other, like DNA fragments and so on.
This becomes a very complicated question because not only are we talking about the strength, we have to talk about the frequencies. And, electromagnetic waves cover everything from infrared that heats to ultraviolet that gives you skin cancer to visible light that you can see to gamma radiation that causes disruption of biological molecules, and everything in between. And so a change in frequency can have a big effect on what this radiation does. And that is very difficult to get at. Not just how the strength is, but what the frequency is. It matters a lot. We all make the assumption that a stronger signal of a given frequency is going to have a greater effect. Some people have said there might be a power window where that particular level of power might have more effect than a stronger signal. But I haven't seen much to back that up. I've heard it suggested, but I haven't seen a lot of that.
Well, I think Igor Belyayev in Sweden made these studies on frequency-dependent effects on the stem cells and found rather powerful effects for certain frequencies. But unfortunately, he was not funded anymore after that first study, so he had to move to another place and stop the research.
Okay, I think we